Hello folks, I wish you a terrific morning as we begin our second day in Joshua Tree National Park. Yeah, it's a park so big that it requires 2 days to really explore. And it just so happens that this park is divided into two main sections, so that's pretty convenient for us. We spend one day in one section, another day in the other section. So we begin today walking along a peculiar string of lush vegetation. Now that's kind of strange for an environment in the middle of California's desert country. So what is all this green vegetation, plants, trees doing here? That is one hairy palm tree. So where we are is right at the center of a fault line. There are many fault lines in California, and that's where you hear about these massive earthquakes that happen. They happen on fault lines, ridges between two different tectonic plates. And so they're always constantly moving against each other, rubbing against each other, sliding back and forth. But in addition to earthquakes, what happens here at these fault lines is something truly magnificent. There's groundwater all throughout this land below us. But once this groundwater touches these fault line areas, well, the water bleeds to the surface, creating an area in the middle of a desert that acts as a hotspot for life. So that's where you get all these green, lush plants, and wildlife as well flocks to this area, because of course they need water too. Look at that, we find more of these desert critters. They're all over the place. And you hear birds chirping everywhere. They love this place. It's not just the wildlife, not just animals and plants, but native people like the Serrano and Cahuilla people inhabited this area as long as these oases around the territory of the modern-day Joshua Tree National Park were thriving with water. It was an attractive place to settle when everything else was barren and desolate and offered no real opportunity to settle. Unfortunately, the natives' way of life in Southern California was forever changed with the arrival of the Americans. They claimed the land and the water. It was a concept that was very foreign to these native people. They felt like the earth and the land around them was to be shared among all people and respected. But they had no choice. They were forced off the land. And with the Americans' heavy farm use around this area, it drained a lot of the water from these oases. Thankfully, the National Park Service is doing its best to preserve... Ooh, there's a bird that flew out of here. But thankfully, the National Park Service is doing its best to preserve what remains of these oases. At this oasis behind us, the water kept receding and dried up, and eventually water pumps had to be used to keep this patch of lush life alive. Yeah, I just thought it would be a nice warm-up to start us off today, this morning, at this nice little oasis right next to civilization. Yeah, that's the gateway town of 29 Palms. Gateway towns like that and the town of Joshua Tree, they're gateway towns. They held a lot of amenities like shops and restaurants and gas stations. Yeah, it's worth mentioning those towns, but that's not very important. We are purely here for the territory inside the national park. So let's begin to dive deep into this vast park once again. Now these are some jumbo-sized rocks. At this part of Joshua Tree National Park, you can find these all over. It's truly difficult to believe that we are in the state of California right now. A view like this reminds one of Arizona, Utah, even Colorado. But I guess we should be believing what we're seeing around us. California is a state truly emblematic of climatic and environmental variety and diversity. If it wasn't for this somewhat apparent marked trail that's guiding us through these crevices and valleys, if you want to call it, one could seriously get lost in the labyrinth that are these jumbo rocks. Oh, this is incredible. Theoretically, one can spend days and days and days here on the well-traveled trails with signs and gravel to mark the path. Or one could spend days and days and days additionally on the backcountry. You know, this whole park is 80% wilderness, so there's lots of opportunity to go out into the wilderness and discover what's there. But for the purpose of this video, I think that's the end of our journeys in the Mojave half of the park. Let's actually venture down towards the transition area and let's enjoy and see if we can try to notice where that transition zone begins and ends, with the landscape, with the vegetation and all that. And furthermore, let's enjoy the rest of our time in the lower Colorado desert. Alright, so I think it's safe to say we have entered the Colorado desert, part of the greater Sonoran Desert, and already I can tell it's a lot hotter and a lot drier. You know, now that we're under that threshold elevation, 3,000 feet, there's drastic changes. I mean, just look around, the plant life is completely different. These cacti are what dominate, not the Joshua trees. So do you see all these alluvial soils, rocks, pebbles, sands, that were actually, in fact, at one point part of the mountain, but through the forces of nature, were slided down to the bottom of this basin? Well, this is a lot of what the Colorado desert sort of looks like. It's very empty, very dry, and you have to think, wow, these remaining plants have to be so hardy and resilient to the dry, hot climate here that they're the only ones that really remain. Sure, you see some of these, what they're called ocotillo plants with big, long stalks and red flowers, but most of the time what you're going to see is just barren scrubs, dead bushes, How could anybody survive here? Well, how about that? How fitting. We start with an oasis and we end with an oasis. We're at the southernmost part of the park. After this, it's just, a 5-mile drive to the exit or the entrance, depending on how you enter this park. And I-10 is just maybe right outside of the park. So, as far as content goes, this might be the last non-extremely strenuous place one can go if you're going north to south. Joshua Tree is not just a park which highlights the Joshua Tree. No, it celebrates the great wonder of Southern California's desert geography. On the west you have the relatively higher Mojave, and on the east you have where we are, the Colorado/Sonoran Desert. A little more hot and dry. It's subtle, but these distinct ecosystems bring themselves completely different worlds from one another. Speaking of different worlds, I mean, if you walk through certain stretches of the park, you'll be amazed to find places that sort of remind you of an extraterrestrial planet, something that really shouldn't be found on this one. Very interesting. It's a recent National Park addition, 1994, but in recent years it has become very, very popular. This is every Los Angeles resident, locals from Southern California's favorite stop to experience the deserts in this half of the state. Now that I think about it, Northern California might have a few specks of desert, but it's nothing compared to the drier, hotter climate here in the southern half of California. It's not just locals who love this place, it's also the international tourist community that loves this place. I've talked to so many people from Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and it seems like whenever they stop in Los Angeles as their first stop and try to go inland, they seem to have Joshua Tree on their list as they go eastward into the vast interior of the Southwest United States. I mean, it makes sense why it's so popular. This getaway from the Los Angeles urban area holds 800,000 acres of outdoor desert recreation. So that's what I can say, Joshua Tree National Park. And I'm very proud to call Joshua Tree National Park number 17. Oh yeah, it's been a bit of time since we added one onto the list, but there we go, number 17, Joshua Tree National Park. With that being said, I've got nothing more to say. Looking at this great, lush oasis in the southernmost reaches of this great national park, not just the Joshua Tree. More travels to come. I will see you at the next location.